G'day you mob, and welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today is an interview episode, and today I am chatting with Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology at Deakin University, Euan Ritchie. Now, on his About Me page, he says that he applies ecological theory with good doses of fieldwork to seek solutions to challenges of conserving biodiversity, and that his main interests, rather wide palette of interests here, include behavioural, community, evolutionary, landscape, and population ecology, as well as conservation biology and phylogeography. Loads and loads of big words there, guys, but in a nutshell, Euan is someone who has an immense passion for Australian wildlife and its conservation. So, the background here, I met Euan back in 2012 when I was studying my PhD. I'd just started and I'd been dragged along to the Mammal Conference in Port Augusta in South Australia, and Euan was there, and if memory serves me correctly, he was doing some impressive work on dingoes and their role in the environment. So I remembered him recently in light of the bushfires that have gone through and reading many articles about the effect that those bushfires have had on Australia's native wildlife, and I thought I would shoot him an email and ask him to come on the podcast to tell us his story about how he ended up as an ecologist, but also to talk about Australian wildlife and bushfires and the pressure that climate change is putting on Australia's native wildlife. So, without any further ado, guys, let's get into it. Euan Ritchie, welcome to the Aussie English Podcast. It's great to have you here. You are Associate Professor at Deakin University of Wildlife Ecology, and I thought it would be great to have you on today to talk about the recent bushfires and Australia's wildlife and what's going to happen in the near future. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Good on you. So starting off, can you tell me a bit about your story? I know that you did your bachelor's and PhD at James Cook Uni up in Queensland. What sparked off your interest in Australian wildlife, but Australian wildlife as well, and turned itself into a lifelong career?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I really got the bug, if you like, for nature ever since I was a little boy. And I spent a lot of time running around actually on rocky platforms, shorelines in Victoria, particularly down on the Monetising Peninsula on the back beaches there, and fantastic rock pools and so forth. And my parents encouraged me, fortunately, and my mum even, when I was younger as well, would help me pick up dead birds on the side of the road and inspect them and do all that kind of weird stuff that people like I still do. As a kid, maybe it's a bit weird, but I guess the point is they really fostered my love of nature, and I had that very early on. And so, and like a lot of, I think, ecologists and conservation biologists, I did think about being a vet at one point. But very quickly realised that I probably wasn't going to have the grades for that. But more importantly, I didn't really, I think, have the, the ability to tell people on a daily basis or a regular basis that their dog or their cat was going to die.
This is why they have such high suicide rates, right? It's kind of like...
It's actually, it's an amazing job that vets do, but I can imagine it's incredibly emotionally challenging. Be like being a nurse, I think, seeing people die or suffering daily. That just wasn't for me. But when I realised that there was an actual job called being a zoologist or a conservation biologist, and you could actually make your whole life helping to conserve nature and running around and being amongst it, I thought that's for me. So,
did you ever get that question? What are you going to work in a zoo?
I got that quite a lot, actually. It's amazing how people don't know what a zoologist actually is. And then I grew up in Melbourne, obviously, and then I thought, I'm going to go to James Cook University to study marine biology, like half of Victorians seem to do.
Why is that such a good choice? Because, as you say, a lot of people end up there.
Well, for that degree, it is one of the places in the world to study marine biology. Now, ironically, of course, one of the many reasons that people go there is to work on the Great Barrier Reef, and unfortunately, that's dying as we speak. But once I got up there, I very quickly realised that not only was the Great Barrier Reef this wonderful thing, but James Cook University in Townsville is incredibly well placed, because within a couple of hours, pretty much in any direction, you have the reef, you have rainforest, you have tropical savannas, you have deserts. You have this incredible ability to be in a huge range of environments and species. So even on JCU campus, there's dingoes on campus.
Really?
There's barred pythons. There's frilled neck lizards. It's a wonderland. And so it's a great place to do an undergraduate degree. And so I spent about nearly 15 years living in North Queensland. So I did my undergrad there, my honours. I was a research assistant for a little bit, my PhD. Then I went back to Melbourne for a year and then went back up there again and did a postdoc. And so I have a pretty long association and love for the North Queensland environments.
What separated you away from, I guess, marine biology? Because James Cook Uni is obviously known for marine biology being so close to the Great Barrier Reef. What tore you away from that and back to terrestrial biology?
A couple of things, I think. One is that I have asthma, so I probably can't dive, which does rule out your opportunities with marine biology. But I also didn't really have a strong fascination with coral and fish as much as I did other things. So they're wonderful things, and I am still in awe of them and still enjoy snorkeling and doing all those things. But I fell in love with other things, and particularly mammals. So I became a terrestrial ecologist primarily.
And so I was looking at your main interests, and they are in behavioral, community, evolutionary, biology, landscape, population ecology, pretty much everything. Was it that you were more of a jack of all trades then in terms of interest than really nutting down and wanting to get into one sort of area, one taxa, one animal, one organism, and tackle that?
Yeah, I have been criticised of that, and I'm probably one of these people that gets fascinated by too many things and jumps from one thing to the next. I would say that my strong passion now is doing research that has a strong applied and conservation focus. And I do a lot of work on mammals and also predator-prey interactions, but also environmental policy. But I think that there's also, I work on a wide array of things, partly also because I think, the world is complex, ecology is complex, and to really make changes in regards to the huge challenges we have, you really can't focus on one organism or one aspect. You really have to be across a number of different things, and that suits my personality because I do have a wide interest in lots of different things. I've also worked on parasites and deformities in frogs in the past as well. I guess the one common thread that my work now has and has had for a long time is that it tends to be quite applied. So it's trying to address a conservation or a management issue, but using science to do that.
So what are some of the biggest questions that you're interested in answering at the moment with your work?
Yeah, so some of the big challenges, of course, that relate to Australia in particular are how can we maintain native wildlife in the presence of invasive predators, so feral cats and foxes being the two really important ones there. So I do a lot of work on that respect. Fire ecology, so understanding how species respond to fire, and that's obviously become ever more important after these recent fires that we've had in this last year. Predator-prey interactions and living with predators. So there's obviously a growing realization about how important predators are in the landscape in terms of all the different things they do. But obviously things like wolves and dingoes and large cats and so forth do threaten people. They can kill livestock and all that sort of thing. So they're a challenging group of animals to try and conserve. And so I'm very interested in how can we minimize human wildlife conflict so we can have benefits both for people and for animals and for agriculture as well. So there's some of the big things that I'm interested in.
Yeah, because there's some of the saddest things, right? I mean, I remember learning about the thylacine, and I'm not sure what the state of current research is in terms of how it went extinct. I know that obviously people hunted it, but there was some stuff from the Smithsonian suggesting they had potentially gone through a bottleneck and were suffering from some diseases at the same time. But there was a big misconception that they were hunting sheep at the time, right? But in actual fact, it was probably that they were just scavenging sheep. The same with wedge-tailed eagles. I think my dad, who's a zoologist, was telling me that wedge-tailed eagles were hunting rabbits heaps when the rabbits were introduced, but that rabbits went nuts because everyone was hunting the wedge-tailed eagles thinking they were killing sheep. So could you talk a bit about our role with predators like that and how it is a balance, and if we do kind of screw with it too much, it ends up that everyone loses?
Yeah, that's right. So I think, the wedge-tailed eagles is a good example that I think there was a lot of misconception out there that they were killing large numbers of lambs. And they do occasionally kill lambs, but very small numbers. But they do also kill foxes, as an example, and foxes kill lambs. But they do take a lot of rabbits, and rabbits are a big problem for agriculture as well as for the environment. And so science now suggests that wedge-tailed eagles are probably almost certainly a net benefit, and probably quite a strong net benefit to have in the landscape. And of course, they have a right to be conserved regardless of what we think anyway.
Are they still repopulating too after 100, 150, 200 years ago when they were being hunted? Are they still recovering from that stage as well?
They may be. I'm not an expert, unfortunately, in wedge-tailed eagles. Obviously, and there's a subpopulation or subspecies of wedge-tailed eagles in Tasmania that are doing far worse. So they're a threatened species. On the mainland, of course, there was a horrible incident, I think it was last year or the year before, of a person in Victoria who'd killed hundreds of eagles over a period of time. Poisoning, and that person was, I think, if they haven't been to court, they're going to court.
Was that intentional?
Intentional, yeah. So they basically poisoned them. And so there's still, unfortunately, examples of that where people are doing horrible things and doing them really, again, with, even if you accept doing that, which I don't, but they're doing it for the wrong reasons. Like, there's just no good evidence that having eagles around is going to have any really substantial impact on your sheep and so forth. And so that's a real shame that sort of mindset still persists. So I think, there is still this real need to understand the benefits predators have as well as the impacts they can have. And so there's good examples with dingoes as an example that, dingoes, one of the probably most important things they do is control kangaroo numbers and keep those numbers lower than they would otherwise be. And so since European settlement, we've cleared a lot of land, we've put in permanent water, and we've killed dingoes in many areas. And that's led to an explosion in kangaroo numbers. And so kangaroos often get in quite high numbers. And then when you have a drought period, those kangaroos die in quite high numbers, which is awful for them. And it also impacts the environment because they often overgraze that environment on their way out. And so having a large predator like a dingo in the landscape is good for the environment. And it's also good for the grazier because if you have less kangaroos, that means less competition with your livestock. And so now, of course, the question is, but what about dingoes eating calves or sheep? And they certainly do. And obviously dingoes and sheep really just don't mix very much at all. Yeah. But cattle, the story is different in that, occasionally dingoes will attack full-grown cattle and
no kidding, full adults.
Yeah, but rarely because it's a dangerous thing for a dingo to do. Yeah. Because cows are large and dingoes are quite small, roughly 15 to 20 kilos max.
Yep.
But they will occasionally take calves as well. But there's been modelling that shows that having dingoes in your landscape, even if they do occasionally attack cattle, it's a net benefit to the grazier.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing with the predator side of it is that we can actually accommodate predators with livestock by using non-lethal approaches. So guardian dogs, so some people might know the movie Oddball, the big white dog that protects penguins. They can also protect livestock. And that's what they were bred for, in fact. And so we do have solutions available to us to accommodate both agricultural as well as ecological and conservation values.
So what are some of the biggest differences with Australia the way it is today, ecologically, environmentally, because of this change in predator composition, in particular on particularly the mainland? I know that we used to have Tasmanian devils, we used to have thylacine, we used to have thylacoleo, a bunch of other predators that were much larger, but they're all gone. Does Australia today really represent what it was like a few thousand years ago?
No, it's dramatically different for a number of reasons. So we've lost all those large predators that you speak of, and we obviously still have Tasmanian devils in Tasmania, and that's it. But they used to be in the mainland as well. But
where they would have been just called devils, right?
Yeah, well, and potentially multiple species. Obviously, we have the thylacine on the mainland too, and many people wouldn't realise that there's cave paintings of thylacines in Kakadu National Park, which is in the Northern Territory. So they had a really wide distribution.
We had 5 species of them or something on the mainland, right? They were everywhere.
There's a lot of work being done to try and work out exactly how many large carnivores we have. I actually noticed today in the media that a new species of marsupial lion has been reported from the Riversley deposits. But the other thing that's changed, of course, is that unfortunately, post-European invasion about 230 years ago, Aboriginal people have been displaced from a lot of the land, and that has influenced fire regimes, that has influenced hunting itself as well, of course. We've cleared huge amounts of land. Australia has one of the highest land clearing amounts in the world. which has changed the habitat structure. And of course, in many areas, we have wiped out dingoes. We've introduced cats and foxes and rabbits, which actually increase cat and fox numbers in many cases.
That's an interesting relationship there that I'd love for you to sort of expand on a bit, right? I know I was looking at some invasive species research recently, and apparently rabbits are by far and away the worst in terms of the number of species that they impact. I think it was 321 species or something. I was expecting the cane toad or something to be way up there, but I don't even think it was in the top 10.
No, I mean, cane toads can have an impact on northern quolls, but compared to some other invasive species, they just don't rate. So when you consider plants that are impacted by European rabbits, it's really high. And there was good evidence of that when the Khaleesi virus went through, that plants that hadn't been seen in the arid zone for decades or more started to emerge because they'd been relieved from grazing pressure. And there's evidence as well from South Australia where rabbits have been suppressed, cat and fox numbers went down, and native mammal numbers went up. And the reason that is, as I was saying, that, you know, cats and foxes love to eat rabbits, and that means their numbers are often higher than they otherwise would be if rabbits were absent. But what that also means is that native animals are trapped in what we call a situation of hyperpredation. So that is that if you have more cats and foxes than you would otherwise have because of rabbits, that even puts further pressure on the remaining native mammals that exist, particularly when rabbits crash, which they do because they go in for booms and busts. And when those rabbits are not available to the cats and foxes to eat, then they look for other food, and that's obviously often the surviving native mammals or reptiles or birds that might be in that environment. Yeah. So rabbits are a huge issue both from a plant's perspective, and that also means shelter for other animals too, but also from the perspective of inflating cat and fox numbers.
Is there any possibility in your eyes as a wildlife ecologist that we'll ever be rid of those species, or are they the kind of species that are here for good?
I can't imagine a scenario, at least in the short term, where we'll be rid of foxes or cats and even probably rabbits, unless people go down the path of CRISPR or gene drive, which there's a lot of interest in, and, you know, it has potential, but is also quite dangerous potentially as well.
Can you expand on that? Sorry, just briefly. I saw some stuff on that on Netflix, and they were talking about introducing CRISPR into New Zealand to get rid of rats, I think it was. What is CRISPR, and how would that deal with our problems with introduced species?
So CRISPR is essentially genetically editing species or individuals, and to try and basically get rid of them, to give them sort of suboptimal traits and so forth that would mean eventually that they would decline, I guess, towards extinction. I'm not an expert at all in CRISPR, so
no, it's all good. I think one example was that they produce animals that can only give birth to males, so you end up with one whole population that's just male, and obviously
that sort of thing can be done. Gene drive is slightly different, where people have been trying to get individuals that may have a tolerance, as an example, to something. So they're thinking about using corals that are heat tolerant to put into areas where bleaching is a problem, or let's say northern quolls that have a natural disposition to avoid cane toads. If you can introduce or favour those in the population, you're essentially accelerating natural selection in a sense, and favouring those individuals that may be beneficial in a conservation sense. So that's sort of what gene drive is all about. So there is potential there, but I should say that, you know, in terms of pest management, yes, it's hard to imagine eradicating those cats, foxes and rabbits at the scale because of their huge distributions and reproductive potential. But we can do things at a local scale. So as an example, ripping warrens for rabbits can be very effective in controlling their local impacts. And in the case of cats and foxes, obviously there's, you know, fencing, there's poisoning and so forth. But probably one of the ones that's still underappreciated is maintaining habitat complexity. So if we can preserve habitat better through reducing overgrazing, through better fire regimes and so forth, it may mean that animals can persist in the presence of cats and foxes because they've still got somewhere to run and hide, right? And so, and we have evidence for that from certain research that's shown that, you know, in areas after fire, cats and foxes can hunt more effectively and find native marsupials. So if we can conserve habitat better, then maybe we can have those invasive predators there still, but their impact will be dampened.
Yeah, I had no idea that because everyone thinks that pet cats are an issue. If they don't like cats, they're always like, you keep your cats inside, they're a massive issue. And it's like, well, actually, there's something like 29 million feral cats in Australia. They're the real population eating, 1 billion animals a year or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. So the number's been revised now. There were some very high numbers. It's now feral population of cats ranges between, I think it's about 2 to 6 million.
That's better. I prefer that number.
Still a lot. And that variation is to do with rainfall. So if you have some series of good rainfall years, cat numbers will build up based on eruptions of other mammals. But during drought periods, which we've just come out of, at least at some parts of Australia, cat numbers are much lower. But the point is that cats occupy 99.9% basically of Australia. There's really nowhere where feral cats aren't.
How the hell have they done so well in places like the desert? That's what I always wonder, where this is an animal that's obviously from, parts of Europe and Asia. How have they done so well to exist in the Australian outback?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, they are just such amazing generalists, and they're able to eat a huge range of food, and they don't need to drink. Is a big thing. So physiologically, they are able to get away without drinking water, and that's interesting because that's also part of the reason why Aboriginal people are actually quite good at hunting them in Central Australia, because although they don't need to drink, physiologically they're almost kind of on the edge, and Aboriginal people can literally run them down, and they wear out very quickly. Now, if you tried to run down a dingo or a fox, you'd want to be a pretty good runner, because they will run and run and run, particularly a dingo. They'll run all day like most dogs can. But cats can't do that because they're sort of physiologically more on that edge.
And they're more ambush predators, right, as opposed
more
to...
ambush, exactly. They're not pursuit predators like a dingo is, which will happily chase after a kangaroo for a long distance. A cat can't do that. But yeah, it is remarkable that they've managed to occupy so much of Australia and impact on so many wildlife species.
So can you talk a bit, shifting gears obviously to bushfires, about why Australia is so synonymous with bushfires ecologically, environmentally, at least in the past, and where that's going, and obviously tie that in with this year's bushfires?
Yeah. So I guess there's a few things there. I mean, fire is not uncommon in Australia, and many of our plants and our ecosystems, in fact, rely on fire. But the really important point to bear in mind is that fires are now changing. Yeah. And so we are seeing more regular fires, we are seeing more extreme fires, and we're seeing plants that even are reliant on fire now being negatively affected by it. So alpine ash, as an example, it needs fire to germinate. But if you have a fire in a short amount of time following a previous fire, so let's say 10 years or roughly, it kills all those young saplings that have come from that fire in the previous one. And so unfortunately, we're now seeing that because of climate change and increasing temperatures, drying out of landscapes and droughts and so forth. We're seeing more frequent fires, and that means that even previously resilient resilient species to fire are being affected by that. And so we saw an example also of that, of course, last year, unfortunately, and in Victoria too, where wet rainforest in southeast Queensland, as well as in Victoria, which really should never burnt. And that's because it got really dry through the drought and fire managed to penetrate. And often if fire gets into rainforest, it means those plants often die, and they may never come back because they may be invaded by a drier plant species and become a woodland. And so we're seeing conversion of habitats from one thing to another. And of course, we also have overlaid on that a huge change in fire regimes associated again with the displacement of Aboriginal people by Europeans, roughly 230 years ago. Now, of course, there are some areas where Indigenous fire practices persist or have been reinstated. So in parts of the Western Australian desert with the Matu people, obviously in Northern Australia, there's a lot of work going into fire regimes, and there's more interest and desire to try and do similar in Southeastern Australia as well. But there's a lot of different things at play. But these latest fires that we've had in Australia since winter, ironically, last year, and that's in
September, right, or even earlier.
Yeah, because some people have tried to frame these fires as the black summer, but it's nothing to do with being black, and it's certainly nothing to do with summer. These fires have actually started in winter last year, in large areas across Australia, and importantly in biodiversity hotspots. So, in the rainforests of southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, the Stirling Ranges of Western Australia, parts of Tasmania, rainforests in Victoria, the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, South Australia, of course, with Kangaroo Island. Really important biodiversity hotspots have all been burnt, and in many cases quite severely. And I've been involved myself in a couple of emergency meetings with Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning in Victoria to try and get scientists together and to say, well, okay, how bad is this, and what should our response be? And it's pretty grim.
Sorry, you go. I was gonna ask, with Indigenous burning, how would two ecosystems look different where one is managed by Indigenous people and one isn't? What are the biggest differences there?
It's really hard to generalise, and I think a lot of what we know about fire regimes and Indigenous people comes from Northern Australia, and also I did mention the Martu in Western Australia, where often their burns will be more patchy and less severe. So, as an example, in Northern Australia, if you have your burns happening at the end of the dry season, when it's very, very dry, those fires can be very intense, very hot, and very large, and they can really remove a lot of habitat and potentially kill some plants and convert woodlands more towards grasslands. If you burn areas towards the end of the wet season and you have what's called a cooler burn, those burns tend to be patchier and less widespread. And so that creates more of a mosaic type habitat, which breaks up fire the next time fire comes around, but also provides a range of different habitat types, which is useful for a whole range of species. And it also means you're not losing things on the ground like logs as well as tree hollows, which so many species depend upon, and those hot fires will often get rid of. And so that's the kind of thing potentially we see with a more traditional Indigenous type fire regime, but I wouldn't want to generalise too much because Australia's a big place. And obviously a traditional fire regime in a wet ash forest is very different to one in a tropical savanna or an open arid landscape.
So it is really all about maintaining that complexity for animals to be able to have a range of different, whether habitats or within a habitat or environments that they can go out into and, live through those events. If there's a bushfire, they can move out and then come back later and repopulate that area. But is that a big problem with this year's fires, is that they were so extensive that it sort of wiped out complexity? So now you just have this homogenous environment of just burnt trees.
That's right. So that's been the really big problem in some places, including East Victoria, where we've had massive fires. And I've seen some of the imagery, and it's quite confronting that you can see literally thousands of hectares that are just burnt and there's nothing there. And bear in mind, the severity and the scale of it. So it's those two things together, so that if you're an animal, there's nowhere to go. And there's also very hard for you to recolonize that area too, because it's such a big burnt landscape. There's just no little pockets left. And again, when you think about things like logs and tree hollows, in some cases it takes decades or over a century for those things to form in a tree. And so you don't just get them back overnight. So even if the grass comes back and shrubs come back, if you're dependent on hollows or tree logs and so forth for breeding and so forth, you may not be able to survive there anymore because those critical habitat attributes are no longer there. And so that is a real concern that we've had that sort of impact at this scale that we've had.
So what are some of the species that are in trouble now? And could you talk about that a bit? Because I know there's over 100 species now in the news, at least, going around saying that they're potentially facing extinction as a result of just these bushfires. They've been pushed even further. Can you discuss that and give us your thoughts?
Yeah, so there's a range of species that we're worried about, and a lot of the work to date really has been focused on vertebrates, so mammals, birds, reptiles, and so forth. There's work that's been done on plants too. Now, there's a lot less known, of course, about invertebrates, and that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But in terms of some of the, high-profile species that have been mentioned, Kangaroo Island Dunnart has had a very large proportion of its habitat burned. I'm trying to remember if it's 80 or 90%. It's a very large proportion.
Yeah, I think it was 80%. I was reading in an article today. It was huge.
Yeah, it's huge. So we're really worried about them, and they're a ground-dwelling small marsupial, which is perfectly primed to be eaten by feral cats on Kangaroo Island. Yeah. So in the absence of habitat cover, they're a real worry, although they've built a fence now on Kangaroo Island to exclude cats and try and help recover that species. The long-footed potteroo in Victoria is a real worry. So that's more of a wet forest type species in the far east of Victoria. It's in its entire distribution, and that has had very large areas of its habitat burnt. Now, encouragingly, there has been camera trap footage showing potteroos after the fires, which is great to see, and we're always keen to see good news and happy stories in conservation wherever we can. So there is hope, but a large area of that species habitat has been burnt, and we know, of course, from the theory that the smaller a species distribution becomes and the more fragmented it becomes, whether it's due to habitat loss or fire, whatever it might be, the more prone that is to extinction in the future as well, because, a population that's small may get genetic problems. It's also more affected by random events. So, you have a flood or another fire or something, if you have 5 individuals and they all go, that's a problem. Whereas if you lose, 10 individuals out of 5,000 individuals, okay, it's sad for those individuals, but it's not a really big problem for the population as a whole. So fragmented populations are a problem. The regent honeyeater is another one that's been discussed. So there's, I think, if I'm right, about 400 adults of those left in the wild, and much of its breeding habitat has been burnt. So that's a migratory bird that's already up against it, and so that's just 3 vertebrate examples.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, of course, all the plant species that we're worried about, and particularly ecosystems. So, huge areas of rainforest have been burnt, and they may now be gone forever, which I find quite confronting. As a father of 2 children and loving the environment, I like nothing more than taking my family out into the environment and seeing wonderful things. And to think that those habitats are potentially lost to us forever. And when you think about, the Great Barrier Reef also having large areas that are now dead, to see that sort of happening in my lifetime over a pretty short period of time is deeply disturbing and confronting.
So maybe you should have been a vet, huh?
maybe ironically, it would have been easier being a vet, hey?
Well, that's it. Yeah, I know. It's one of those things. The Great Barrier Reef really depresses me sometimes because it seems like it's so out of your control with the salinity in the ocean and carbon dioxide. It seems like even if Australia was to change everything, it's not going to be able to change the salinity in the ocean around the Great Barrier Reef, I imagine. Yeah,
I mean, there's the acidity and the increasing temperatures and the runoff. All of those things are affecting the reef. I think for me, what concerns me is that, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in Townsville in the sort of mid to late 90s, the reef was still a wonderland. It was this incredible place. And, we're only talking about sort of, 25 years later, and large chunks of that are now dead or dying. And there's bleaching events happening as we speak. And about to happen. And so, that's a really short amount of time. And sort of, I guess I never thought in my lifetime I would be confronted by these really big changes in the environment. I always read about them. We had warnings, of course, from climate scientists, from ecologists like myself, that these things would happen. But when they actually happen, it's really confronting. And more important than that, I think when they happen, but there's still not a huge response from our own government, from international governments to do what we need to do to stop more of this happening, that's what worries me, because I thought, the reef's dying, but hey, maybe it'll be now that we actually change. No. And then I thought, maybe after this fires, this will be the big moment where we change. And so far, no. So I guess I sort of question as a conservation scientist, as well as a dad of, kids, when will it be enough? When will we actually go? We can't keep going on like this because... And the predictions are, of course, that this is just the beginning. Things could get worse, a lot worse.
So what is your expectations of the future, not just necessarily the world, more specifically, I guess, Australia? What do you think is going to happen in terms of our ecology and our environments with climate change and, other things that are affecting it?
Yeah, look, it's a great question and one that I think about a lot. And I think it really depends on a couple of things. If we continue business as usual, then there's going to be dramatic changes and we're going to lose a lot of species. And, there will be winners and losers like there always is with change. But, species that, of course, are not very resilient to changing climate, like the barrier reef, like the rainforests that are impacted by fire or salinity, by acidity and increasing temperatures and so forth, they're going to potentially be lost to us forever. Now, if we do change, then things could look really, really differently. Now, there's already going to be changes because we've had such a huge impact on the environment. And even if we do really rein in our unsustainability, it's still going to take time for that to manifest and really put the brakes on what's happening. So it is really hard to know exactly how bad things would get. And I try to remain an optimist about, that we will actually make some pretty big changes in terms of divesting from fossil fuels rapidly and urgently, and also even lifestyle choices about how much meat do we eat, fast fashion. A lot of people don't realize that one of the biggest impactors on the environment in the world is fashion, and particularly fast fashion. So a lot of attention is put on meat and on flying and so forth, and rightly so. But fashion, as an example, also doesn't get a lot of attention. So if we could really change our own individual choices about those things, then there's potential huge gains that we can make quite quickly. And I hope that actually occurs. So far, it hasn't happened to the degree that it needs to. But yeah, to know how much the ecology and the environment's going to change is really going to be dependent on those two paths that we could go down. One is don't change things very much and let the chips fall where they may, and predictions show that's not going to be very pleasant for any of us, and potentially at some point could lead to our own, existential crisis. Or ideally, listen to the scientists, listen to the experts, and make some big changes and make them fast.
So to finish on a positive note, in your research, are there any animals that you've been studying in Australia that are really thriving in the times of human beings, that are doing really well?
Yeah, well, a really nice example of that, I think, is the southern brown bandicoot, and a PhD student, Sarah McLagan, of mine, in our group. She's done some really neat work around Melbourne that has shown southern brown bandicoots living in amongst the suburbs and around.
Oh, no kidding.
And part of that, and that's an endangered species, and a species that, again, is typically heavily affected by things like feral cats and foxes. And it turns out they're doing reasonably well in those outer urban areas because there's still some habitat left. And so they're also living in what you would otherwise think is pretty degraded habitat. So there was a very large swamp in the southeast of Melbourne called the Kuirup swamp by Indigenous people. And that's been largely cleared and modified and turned into agricultural land, and also now increasingly urban residential land. But there's these sort of narrow linear remnants that are invaded by blackberry and all sorts of other weeds. But that's fine in terms of habitat cover for bandicoots. And so those bandicoots have adapted to quite a novel system. Wow. And they're even doing things like going into people's backyards and eating out of dog bowls. So they are an example of an animal, so far at least, that has managed to adapt to a pretty dramatically different habitat to the one they formerly lived in. But I guess the point there is that, yes, that's a good news story, but again, if we push these things too far, then maybe even the bandicoots won't persist. And of course, they shouldn't have to do that. There should be places left in the world where, plants, animals, etc., can persist without heavy influence from us. And I don't mean us being absent either, because there's been this kind of, I think, unhelpful attitude that, national parks should be free of people. But if we break down connection between people and other species, that actually probably is a disservice to conservation. So it's really more about learning to live with nature in a way that's more compatible and sustainable, but not separating the two.
Well, it's pretty difficult, isn't it? Because you want nature to survive, but in the world's capitalist kind of society, you have to monetize nature in order to give it a reason to survive. And I mean, as a sort of side note, I know that a lot of people hate hunting in places like Africa, but there was a story, and I've forgotten exactly where it was, where they had a big safari set up, or a big place where there were all these animals like elephants and rhinos and lions, and they had hunting set up there where tens of thousands of dollars were paid per hunt. Yeah. And that ended up getting shut down. And the moment it was shut down, all of the poachers came in, killed everything. And so it's one of those things that sucks, but at the same time, you kind of have to work out, if we just leave national parks alone and don't touch them, no one's going to give a shit because they're not going to go there to enjoy them. Yeah. And so you have to find out a way of making them enjoyable but sustainable, right?
Yeah, and I think really that highlights what most conservation biologists these days are aware of and trying to improve on, that any issue is a social issue and a cultural issue. And unless you address social and cultural issues in conservation problems, you're not going to have much success. And in terms of monetizing things, yes, of course, people do want to put a dollar sign on how much things are worth. And there's a whole literature around what people call ecosystem services and how much, certain things are worth to us. How much is a forest worth in terms of purifying the air and stopping erosion. But I think that also misses the point too, in that there's multiple values of species, and we need to do a better job of conveying those values in terms of, species have a right to exist. They have aesthetic beauty. They have aesthetic value. They have cultural value. Obviously dingoes, an example, have cultural value to Indigenous people in some cases. So, there's multiple ways to look at the value of something. But I think absolutely, if we want to conserve species, we have to address the social, the cultural, the economic, and the environmental dimensions.
Wow. Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology at Deakin University, Euan Ritchie, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Probably the easiest way is to find my website, which is just euanritchie.org. And also, if you just search Euan Ritchie, Deakin University, I'm also on Twitter. And I've written, I think it's 50 plus conversation articles now. So you're going to read about some of our research there as well. So they're the main ones.
And are you looking for students? I know that a lot of academics are quite often looking for students. So feel free to give a plug if you are.
More than happy to talk to prospective students if they want to potentially join our group. And I'm also just happy to talk to people in general about the environment and conservation. So if you're interested in conservation and some of the sort of stuff that I do, please just drop us a line.
No worries. Thank you so much once again, Euan.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, so that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much once again for joining me on the Aussie English Podcast. I hope you have a ripper of a week, and I will see you next time. Peace.